Evelyn Hamilton. Our team is outlined about 4 different projects. So there were 2 components to that, remote sensing for burn severity, which I'll touch on briefly, and then our analysis of fire skips and fire refugia. So those are recorded if you want to go back and compare with what we found then and what we said we'd be doing with what we actually got done in the intervening 3 years. Now we'll start off with some acknowledgements right at the top here. I'm really just a collator of information collected by other people who did all the heavy lifting, some of whom are in the room here today, and with funding by a variety of federal and provincial agencies and a lot of in-kind contributions. Okay, we're still in business. So I'm going to organize the talk around 3 main questions. First, talking about satellite-based burn severity. We have several indications that maybe it should be refined. Then we're going to pursue further this question of why some stands, especially some juvenile pine plantations and some forest types, seem to escape crown fire in particular, and what those mechanisms might be as they relate to microclimate and fuel moisture. And then finally, how can we extrapolate from those results to talk about conservation planning, community safety, and forest management, for which we undertook some fire simulation modeling. So starting with satellite-based burn severity, you're probably mostly familiar with the use of these various indices, the difference or delta normalized burn ratio based on satellite images before and after fires, variously scaled or indexed to then provide themed color-coded maps, sometimes 3 classes, sometimes up to 7, as in this example here. And usually you'll see the green areas marked as unburned or low burn severity, scaling through yellow, orange, and red to the high severity burn areas. Now, those are done across North America. The BC government is now undertaking the mapping of all fires greater than 100 hectares. It used to be done sort of on a one-off basis. Now it's quite regularly done by Forest Analysis and Inventory Branch. And this has a lot of implications to further management, whether that be salvage, logging, or restoration. They should be calibrated, however, which we are not doing in BC. They should be ground truthed, essentially using some kind of ground-based burn assessment. And the standard currently developed in the States is the Composite Burn Index. That's a scorecard approach that has 4 components evaluating the degree of damage and recovery in the overstory, the understory, and in the substrates. Now, this is a truly ecological severity assessment because it looks at things like change and recovery in the understory vegetation. So it's not just a damage assessment. It's not really an impact assessment of the fire. Okay, it's often done year or years later from the fire. So we're talking about the ability of the system to rebound as well. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it generates scores. It's a lot of subjective weighting on a scale of 0 to 3. So here's some results that we found from our campaign of Composite Burn Index assessments. This work was led by Sam Coggins and helped out by a lot of UNBC students, looking at some of our big fires in 2018 and the Plateau Complex from 2017. And we found that the difference normalized burn ratio did a very good job of identifying burned versus unburned forest. Okay, we could get that 87% correct. But categorizing these low, moderate, and high, you can see there's a lot of leveled off their CBI values. Not so good at determining. We can tweak those boundaries back and forth a little bit, and we could improve it for
you know what I mean? Like that's these questions
plantations. We're still playing with it for the broadleaf leading and different age classes of unmanaged forest. But the take-home message here is believe the burn versus unburned, not so much the higher burn severity metrics. Here's an example of some problems with the different forest types. On the left, we see a typical high severity burn area from the Nadina fire south of Houston here, the Nadina Lake fire. And you see charred stems, no twigs left, often a lot of bare ground because it was scorched right down to mineral soil. Contrast that with an aspen stand mapped as the same high burn severity. And you see tree crowns that do have their branches intact, no charring up the stumps, and a rapid recovery or regrowth of fireweed and blue joint reed grass coming in afterwards. So we're suggesting that the spectral signature that needs to designate high severity for aspen stands needs to be much higher than it does for conifer leading stands. So we played around with some of those and using some perhaps overly simpler linear regressions, came up with different thresholds for juvenile conifer plantations, mostly lodgepole pine, the broadleaf leading stands, and other natural conifer leading stands. And again, I would emphasize, believe the burned versus unburned mapping, and the overstory component of the CBI results, even though all of the literature, all of the work we've published and are trying to publish is emphasizing the full CBI score, because that's what's done. I'm suggesting that in many cases, we're more interested in just the overstory. Did the trees burn and survive or not? Not will the ecosystem come back? And that's important, obviously, for fire control, community safety, but also for timber management, because right now in BC, they've recently tried to streamline the process for salvage logging. And they're probably not and shouldn't go into the low severity burns because they're still mostly green. They're probably not, the industry doesn't want to go into the high severity burns because there's so much charcoal deep into the standing bowls. So they're going to be targeting the moderate severity stands. So we need to get this right in the long run. Okay, question 2. What about these plantations that seem to escape crown fire? And I thank Jim and Larry for pointing out this phenomenon to me some 5 years ago, which just didn't make sense because it seems to be contrary to all our understanding of high crown bulk density, canopy bulk density in continuous conifer stands as being more likely to burn. Yet these stands repeatedly show up as not being burned. Here's a picture from, again, the Nadina Lake fire. You can see those nice square cut blocks. Turns out most of them are about 20 to 40 years old. And here's another scene further west, also in that same fire. You can see that visual effect flying over, and it does show up in the burn severity theming that the province did as well. So a master's student and I, Andrew Boxwell, did a chi-square analysis of an overlaid of the VRI and the burn severity maps, and concluded that, in fact, yes, for half of the 14 fires of 2017 and 2018 that we addressed, there was this significant difference. That is that H class 2 cut blocks survived, remained unburned more than you would expect by chance relative to the overall burn level within the fire perimeter. But it's a very small reduction in overall probability or proportion burned, 4 to 16%, or an average of 7% in those that were significant, 4.7%, 5% across all fires. On the other hand, no plantations burned with greater likelihood than the unmanaged forest. So there's a signal here, there's a difference, but it's not big. Once we had that data set prepared, though, we could look at other things such as forest age and composition. And we played around with the broadleaf component, where again, we found some significant effects of broadleaf reducing the amount of fire. So there on the left column, you see reductions from 75 to 67% burned, 83 to 76. Again, not much, but significant. On the other hand, we also found some fires that had greater burning of the aspen leading stands, okay? So I think this is somewhat related to some variations in elevation, that is that the aspen dominates more in the same valley bottoms that are susceptible for other reasons and south-facing slopes and so on. And also those that have grassy understories. The most deciduous burns happen in spring. There's a couple of articles out recently that talk about the spring blip in low moisture levels and in spring fires that tend to be human caused. But this still remains a big question with a lot of subtleties. So the idea that just because the broadleaves have more foliar moisture content, 150, 170% moisture compared to conifers that are typically under 120, 130%, that doesn't mean they're less flammable all places all the time. So we dove into these patterns of fire resistance. I'm not going to call it resilience, resistance in the plantations a little bit further. And this was led by Alana and Kira Hoffman and with help from Ingrid Farnell, where forget the categories. They just looked at that satellite-based index, the difference normalized burn ratio from Sentinel-2 imagery before and after the fires, and did a whole data mining exercise there, looking at dozens of potential explanatory variables from the VRI maps, from the results database of silvicultural activities, based on topography, based on fire weather and what rate of spread as near as we could estimate it, and accounting for some spatial autocorrelation. And what fell out from there was a fairly consistent signal of the stand age effect. Okay, so that's in order from top to bottom, the left diagram there, that's plantation age, crown closure, then some spatial autocorrelation issues. Then we get into drought code and some other structural features, maximum temperature. So that's a whole ranked list of priorities among 6 of the big wildfires from 2018. Throw them all together for the graph on the right, looking just at stand age. And here we're just talking plantations. We're not talking about old growth. A lot of scatter, but some central tendencies there that match what we've been observing. Okay, so you get a bit of a fire susceptibility for the first 2 years after logging. I would suspect that's related to slash loads. Then you have a reduced or moderate fire susceptibility for maybe another 7 years as it greens up. Then it's high again. I'm not sure why. Maybe as you get crown closure. But then it stays relatively low. You're verging on the unburned category, the green line there, from ages about 18 to 40 or more, and then we start running out of good data. So a strong signal there. We might group some of those categories into the standard fire behavior triangle of what is affected by fuel compared to weather and topography issues. And it turns out, surprisingly, that fire weather is not the driving factor of burn severity, but really those fuel differences were in 5 out of 6 fires. Now, this should be couched in the terms that these were the big fires that all happened under very high fire weather danger. So we didn't have a lot of variation to test there. But in contrast, a recent study came out by a UVic student with help from some of the CFS folks down in Victoria that looked at all of the fires burned from 1980 to 2020. And so for lightning-caused fires, the set of variables on the right there, that's where the fire weather variables come out on top. For the human-caused fires, the left set of categories, those human-associated factors such as road proximity and community proximity, what they call the EQ mean, were more important, as we'd expect. And that supports some of the assumptions we made in future modeling efforts. They originally started out looking for mountain pine beetle signature. did not emerge near the top of all fires. But if you looked at fires just that made it to greater than 100 hectares in size, it did become more important in the top 5 or 10 factors. Okay, back to our analysis, Alana's analysis. What effects of different stand management treatments in those plantations? It turns out there are significant effects of a history of site preparation, whether mechanical, mostly disc trenching, or broadcast burning, and a significant effect of brushing and spacing in most cases, but in one of the fires, I think it was the shovel fire, spacing, those stands that had been spaced actually had greater burn severity. So a little bit of a mixed signal there. But it is clear that fuel or vegetation management by altering stand structure and fuel continuity can have an effect some places, sometimes. This does agree with the big picture from the state, a recent meta-analysis showing the benefits of prior wildfire, thinning, prescribed burns, and so forth. But here they assessed the lag effect, that effectiveness decreases. Here they made a division between before 10 years and after 10 years, which is not something we addressed, but I would like to yet. So, implications and applications. Yes, we do have fire skips around those juvenile plantations. Stand age is a driving variable, some up and down. We still don't know a lot of the why. Silvicultural treatments can be effective. Notice that this did not test specifically fuel reduction treatments. Okay, most of the spacing, for example, that was done in the results database was purely for silvicultural growth and yield purposes, not really to reduce wildfire susceptibility, which has a different set of rules and guidelines for spacing, pruning, and reducing the continuity of fuels. But all of these activities happen out on the landscape on an annual basis, right? Whether it's planting, harvesting, thinning. So if there are different effects of those treatments, you really need to update your fuel susceptibility, fire vulnerability maps on an annual basis. So now into the why, a little more of an academic question. Why do those juvenile pine plantations have greater fire resistance? So we pursued 2 hypotheses. This was mostly done in cooperation with fellow researchers at UNBC and with assistance and uptake from Vanessa Ford with the Ministry of Forests. She's a forest climatologist who helped us set up microclimate monitoring stations in open, recent clear-cut stands, typically 4 to 7 years old, in some of these juvenile pine plantations and in nearby old growth. So we had a cluster of 3 sites within 40, 50 kilometers of Prince George, another cluster of 3 sites within 40, 50 kilometers of Smithers. And then we also had students go out as frequently as they could, usually a cycle of every 2 or 3 days, to collect samples of duff, fine woody materials, and foliar conifer foliage to do weighing for moisture content. So that was done in the summers of 2021 and 22. Then the funding ran out for the students, and Vanessa kept going with the microclimate monitoring last year. So a lot of these data have yet to be written up. But in general, the trends seem fairly consistent. Usually the microclimate of these juvenile stands is intermediate, as you might expect, between open and old growth conditions. So this slide shows temperature. The juvenile stands are in red, old growth in green, out in the open in blue. I think this is 2021. So we got our spike there with the heat dome that happened at the end of June. And you can quite reliably predict those temperatures, microclimate conditions near the ground, okay, where that fuel bed is first warming up Sensors were at about 30 to 35 centimeters above the ground, compared to what's happening at your standard weather station collecting data in the open at 1.5 meters or something like that. And you can see that the conditions are more or less the same at night, under 15 degrees temperatures, and they diverge a little bit more with higher temperatures. But then there's the exception. Sometimes and at some sites, and usually when talking about the extremes, the conditions in the juvenile pine stands do seem to be less conducive to fire. So for example, in our heat dome, and I forget where this was, at the Tamarack site near Tamarack Lake, just west of Prince George, it stayed cooler. We did not quite get the same extreme high temperatures in the juvenile pine stands, obviously, than we did in the open, but also unlike what was achieved in the old growth because of the gappy structure there. Similarly, some of the humidities on the right stayed higher for much of the summer in those juvenile pine stands than you did in either the old growth or the open. Okay, so those are the extremes, the minimum RH, the maximum temperature. So as any wildfire behavior specialist will tell you, often when dealing with wildfire, fire weather prediction, it's the extremes that you're trying to understand rather than what the averages are. And that's especially true when it comes to wind. And here's where we did find a consistent microclimate effect. And that is that winds, both averages and gusts, were always lower in the juvenile pine plantations. And I was worried that we didn't have the technology, but Vanessa stepped up with some high-grade equipment. We're detecting it down to 0.25 meters per second. Okay, my old equipment could only kick in and turn the anemometer at 1 meter per second. But there's good evidence that we're not even getting that little bit of a breeze in the juvenile pine stands because it's a very dense closed canopy. It buffers the wind from moving, right? And so that's important if you go to your basic theory of crown fire initiation, paper from almost 50 years ago now. Charlie Van Wagner pointed out that you will only get crown fire spreading if there's an adequate horizontal heat flux with a mass flow of fuel through the flaming front. So the wind is what provides that horizontal heat flux. The wind essentially feeds fuel through the flaming front. If you think of the flaming front as stationary, the wind is like a conveyor belt of fuel into the flames. So you need wind to have a crowning fire. What about the fuel moisture monitoring? Some differences. The duff stays nice and moist longer in the old stands. You can't see his face. That's Clayton Rose, one of our Smithers students who was out there doing the rotation through the sites up the McDonald, down towards Houston, up the Chapman. They were dried in the oven. Again, the BC Wildfire Service gave us use of their ovens and access to tanker base to put these samples through. The fine woody material just dries out more in the open. No difference between juvenile and old growth stands. Conifer foliage, this was a bit of a surprise. Those trees sampled in the open, which were mostly saplings, right? They were a meter or two high, was significantly higher. And there's other evidence again and again that vigorously growing young trees, not the ones that are 20 years old, or maybe we didn't sample the top foliage, just have more juicy material to them, whether it's the woody material or the foliage. But none of this is suggestive of greater fire resistance, more moisture in the juvenile stands than in both old growth and open conditions. Nonetheless, a master student working with Dr. Joseph Shea, Roland Jiao, was interested in looking at the signature since we had the data. between those foliar moisture samples and satellite imagery. And there's a relationship there, some possibilities of further monitoring with the NDVI or NDMI codes, but again, a lot of scatter. And interesting, some different relationships amongst locations. So implications, not much happening in terms of air temperature and humidity, but the extremes could be important. And that reduced wind speed, I would say, is now the primary explanatory factor, which would also agree with our on-site and air photo evidence of the behavior of fire when it encounters these plantations. I see Larry nodding, which is greatly assures me. So you see from that, you can see from that photo that usually the fire would venture into the plantations, and you'd see a few spot burns here and there, but it would often peter out in that first 5-10 meters or so. Okay, so it's not as if they weren't in there. So again, no fuel moisture differences consistent, but it also gets one thinking that if low wind is important and if fuels dry out more in the open, should we be thinning stands or thinning them too heavily as part of our wildland urban interface fire smart programs? I'm not sure that the lessons that came from the naturally open and gappy forests in the western states applies to our continuous canopy lodgepole pine spruce fir forests up here. Although some of the work from the Rocky Mountains from Colorado would suggest it does still work, but you know, those Rocky Mountain foothill lodgepole pine forests are not really like ours either, so caution. Okay, final stage here, and then hopefully we'll have lots of time for discussion. Trying to put it all together with some fire risk modeling. Now, as many of you probably know, the way this has been done in Canada for the last 20 or 30 years is based on Canadian Forest Service empirical calibrations of fire behavior, primarily in boreal and eastern forests, in which we then group fuel types, the vegetation, into, 16 categories here. The fuel types that are coniferous, deciduous, mixed wood, slash, and open. And they have also supported development of the Prometheus fire behavior model, which is a deterministic wind-driven model. So you see in the center diagram top there, the direction of the wind describes the direction of the fire. And you can implement that for a given land base with the terrain and weather and fuel information to come up with a fairly useful tactical description of fire behavior for an individual fire. Then if you run Prometheus hundreds and thousands of times on a landscape, as they do in Burn P3, another Canadian Forest Service product there, that's the technical report led by Marc-Andre Parisien, you can come up with an overall fire risk or vulnerability on a given landscape. So the problem is this grouping. How do we classify our BC forests into this by now obsolete set of categories from the boreal? And some recent research came out of UBC testing it for the southern interior. And it's right there in the headline, forest types misrepresent forest structure for purposes of fire behavior prediction. So our approach was to just go with the empirical evidence, what burned and didn't burn in the 2018 wildfires. So here another team came forward, building on some of the data sets that Elena and Kira had already assembled. And we now looked at not just the plantations like they did, but the unmanaged forest as well. So Don Morgan headed this up, again, using a random forest data mining package, and came up with a number of contrasts between burned and unburned areas using some of those modified thresholds for the DNBR data that I showed you earlier. And there's some surprises in there. Look at that percent broadleaf. Again, unburned areas had only 20% on average Broadleaf component, whereas the burned areas had 23. Is that significant? Maybe not. Maybe it's elevation related, so forth. Other parts did agree with some of the things we saw in our ground plots. Shorter trees, higher crown closure, a history of site preparation. Some things didn't agree. His analysis showed lower stand density, more likely to remain unburned, likely to burn, whereas our composite burn index CBI plots showed that higher stand densities. Do I have this right? Unburned, less likely to burn. That's right. Okay. We had in our ground plots, less likely to burn at high densities. So taking his probabilities of burning from that analysis and applying it to the vegetation resource inventory map for the Lakes TSA, he basically generated a fire susceptibility map. And we can compare that with existing products produced by the province, in which they did try to shoehorn the BC forest types into the CFS fuel types. So that's outlined. The procedure is well documented in a technical report by Dan Parakis out of the Pacific Forestry Center. And they did as good a job as they could. So there's some similarities and differences there. You see some clusters of red around places like Burns Lake and Houston, relatively low and in the south-facing slopes. But there's some differences too. Another thing that showed up is you'll notice in the map on the right, produced in 2021, it shows the footprint of the recent wildfires from 2018 as being largely non-susceptible. Okay, those green and yellow areas from the Nadina and the Island Lake and the Verdun Mountain fires, whereas Don's analysis, also based on updated VRI, presumably updated, did not pick out that footprint of previous fires as necessarily being more fireproof now. So that is just a fuel susceptibility map. Then Don and Andrew Fall took that information to calibrate or modify the CELES model, a spatially explicit landscape event simulator. It's been around for 20 years, now widely used for everything from fire risk assessment to timber supply analysis, to develop what he's now calling the TEF model, a time-based empirical model. So again, like Prometheus, it's a wind-driven model with some random offsets. So slope functions as a wind modifier. It's got spotting drawn from a frequency distribution from 100 meters to 2,000 meters. So you need a interpolated wind speed and direction layer from weather stations, collect all the data that's available from those BCWS weather stations, and essentially try to repeat a fire season. So they chose the 2018 fire season. If we were to do it again, we might draw from several big years of fire. Let's do 2018, 2021, 2023. All of them had severe fire conditions. So exercise that model with random point ignitions that are like lightning, supposed to represent lightning, and human ignitions only next to roads where humans tend to congregate. 58 to 42% ratio between the two is the overall average across the province, 58% of fire. We could calibrate that maybe a little more for the north if we want to, and run it 10,000 times. And the map there portrays the number of times a pixel, a 1 hectare area burned. Okay, so those darker violet and blue areas were hit 60 to 90 times. In contrast, the green areas were only hit once. So the first thing that crops out of this map is that strong lake effect. Okay, the big lakes, Babine Lake, Francois Lake, Utsa Lake, do prevent fires from crossing under primarily westerly, southwesterly winds to get to the north or the northeast, the eastern side. but it takes the big lakes. Okay, it didn't matter for just, you know, the small ones or the small rivers or roads. So the final experiment then was to test scenarios of fuel modification. Let's say specifically in the WUI around Burns Lake town site, 2 kilometers out, we tested different widths. And here we're talking about not just a cat guard or 10 meters, but 100 meters had no effect, 300 meters, 600, 900 meter buffers, either exposed to 2/3 thinning of what was originally in that forest cover, convert it all to broadleaf, or have no fuel whatsoever. And it had surprisingly little effect, okay, because of that importance of spotting. Okay, the spotting frequency from multiple locations eventually means something's going to cross those barriers. So I think we have to be very careful in promoting fire smart treatments, or even the idea of, I think Kevin was the one who told me, build all your golf courses around town. Surround your town with golf courses. That's not going to necessarily work either, because spotting will eventually punch through. So implications, some good agreements with previous studies, some anomalies, especially regarding broadleaf and spacing effectiveness. Hopefully we can contribute these sorts of findings into the next generation fire behavior prediction system that are now being undertaken by the Canadian Forest Service with an emphasis on structure. That fire susceptibility map is probably a useful product in itself for planning tactical and strategic locations for fuel treatment or suppression. But it might be worth comparing why we have agreement or disagreement with the province's strategic threat assessment map. Though the signal from those, that lake effect is certainly noteworthy, and something we can test by looking at the extent of fires that historically have occurred or have gotten bigger in those areas. And again, further to our discussion here, fire spread is very sensitive to spotting distances. So we need to improve that calibration as a function of wind speeds and tree heights and the dominant species. And again, no guarantees. So moving on, we now are pursuing another 3 years with the support of the Moore Foundation. And this is a team led by Kevin Kreese, with Don Morgan and Andrew Fall, and I think some other people in the room are going to get drawn into this as well. We still have some analysis and write-up to get into the stand microclimate and fuel moisture relationships and their tie-ins with the fire weather maps and remote sensing. I would like to do an expanded retrospective analysis of regional wildfires over the last 10 years, starting with those that are greater than 100 hectares, not just those greater than 10,000, to further refine the DNBR thresholds, take account of time lags of previous fires and mountain pine beetle. We need to have a better handle on when did each pixel or hectare of land burn, was it day or night, what time, what date exactly. And also, I just met with Brad Martin yesterday afternoon to look at the feasibility of first filtering out where the suppression efforts were, because we didn't do that before. We didn't discount where fuel guards had been put in place, or where air tankers had been operating, or where backfires had been lit. So I think we can do a better job yet. And we need to tap into a lot of the knowledge that people like him, like Larry, have in their heads. Dana Hicks and Prince George, local knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge. What stops fires under different conditions? We could maybe make a set of if-then rules to add to our modeling efforts. And we should also consult with communities and forest managers to find out, well, what management scenarios are realistic to test. This now is going to focus on the Bulkley-Maurice watershed as a whole. And hopefully we'll have some, improved estimates and empirical data to support the spotting and rate of spread as well. So we do still have some time for questions, so thank you for your attention, and let's talk about it. It's imperfect, but I think we've got some interesting results here.